Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Stephanie Green, part of the festival organizing committee, and this year's festival is made possible by the generous support of our festival sponsors, Brattleboro Community Television, Jenny Altschuler and Barry Green, Elizabeth Caitlin, the Stepansky Family Trust, the Vermont Humanities Council, and poets and writers. We would also like to thank our advertisers, and we encourage you to support them. The festival is run entirely by volunteers, but has very real expenses. So we encourage you to make a donation at one of the donation boxes sometime this weekend, or you can use the QR code to donate online through our website. Please take a moment now to turn off the ringer on your cell phone, but feel free to use it to take photos and share them with us on social media. Okay, a little housekeeping here. Rob Franklin was born in Atlanta, is a writer of poetry and fiction, and is co-founder of Art for Black Lives. He received his BA from Stanford and his MFA in creative writing from NYU. He teaches writing at the School for Visual Arts and edits fiction for Joyland. Really good novels put the reader into a new pair of shoes. Not necessarily comfortable, but compelling nevertheless. In Rob Franklin's astutely observed and poetically rendered debut novel, we are privileged to travel with Smith through the labyrinth of race and class in America. Smith has lived, if not always enjoyed, his position as an upper middle class queer black man, well-educated son of a surgeon and a college president, whose aspirations for their son they make abundantly clear. When he's caught with a controlled substance, Smith is reminded that race trumps class in America. Kaveh Akbar, author of Martyr, wrote about the book thusly. I love this quote. It's thrilling to see any author today aiming for the big stuff, all at once: death, race, sex, class, addiction. It's beyond thrilling, incandescent even, when a writer like Rob Franklin comes along with the formal virtuosity to carry those lofty conceptual ambitions. Franklin's prose is also eminently readable, frequently laugh out loud funny, and full of sentences I want to cut out and glue to my forehead. Please welcome Rob Franklin.
Thank you for that intro, and thank you for having me. I'm just going to start with a quick reading. You don't really need any context because this is from the prologue at the very beginning of the book. In the grand scheme of history, it was nothing, a blip, a breath. The time it took Smith to pocket what might have looked like a matchbook or stick of gum to an unwitting child, but was, in fact, 0.7 grams of powdered Colombian cocaine, flown in from Medellin, cut with amphetamine in Miami, and offered to him in Southampton by a boy whom he knew from nights out in the city. 0.7 grams heavier, he loped back through the crush of rhythmless elbows and cloying perfume, which wafted up and dissolved in the damp and sultry night, the very last of summer. Looking around, he realized it was really just a restaurant. By the front door, at least 50 people huddled, breathing down each other's necks as they shouted names they hoped would capture the doorman's attention, while in the backyard were hundreds more. Dozens of tables now shook with the weight of dancing, bodies lit with the particular mania reserved for the end of East Coast summers, when one becomes aware of the changing season, the coming cold. But for now, it was silk and linen, the expensive musk of strangers. Every face appeared familiar, some because he actually knew them, while others only bore a sun-tanned resemblance, the pleasing symmetry of the rich. These were the faces which seemed to populate the whole of his young life, colleagues in one-night stands from the clubs called Cool downtown. These faces had appeared at bars, brunches, birthdays, holiday soirees which black tie was optional, and before New York and freshman seminars and frat parties, and before that on teen tours or tennis camps where they'd been acne spotted, their original forms intact, and here they'd all come, every one of them, to escape the inhospitable heat of Manhattan and enjoy a seaside breeze. Picture him stumbling. 6 feet and 3 inches, he towered like a tree, bark brown and quietly handsome. Picture him crouched in a corner as he snorts from a key, the metallic taste of his tongue. The night gleamed back into clarity as he steadied himself to return, when out of the crowd 2 men emerged, stern-eyed and square-jawed, barking orders he could barely discern. Calmly, he followed. He didn't wish to make a scene. Out through a side exit and onto the street, silent but for the bass of a bop that had rained on the charts all summer. Here is where the night splits open along its tight-stitched seam. The realization, arriving at a tan vehicle marked Southampton Police, that these men in khaki polos were not the club's security he'd assumed at first they were. The night bled surreally. Smith watched himself be searched as if from a perch above, watched his limbs grow limp and pliant as they bent behind his back, the rotated view of girls in wedges, their clothes wrong, the stars wrong. Yes, the greater sense was not of shock, but unreality. All of this was staged, a prank, a punk, the actors in the front seat too handsome to be cops. The men were swift and practiced. After he'd handed over $500 cash from an ATM upstairs at the station, they brought him down to be printed, ID'd, and photographed. They were done in 20 minutes, after which he was handed a paper slip and his things in a plastic bag, then sent back into the wounded night. He called an Uber. On the curb, Smith watched Phosphene's blinker in the darkness, a chorus of cameras flashing. He'd worn, in his mugshot, a vintage Marnie gingham shirt, loose-fit linen trousers, and a gently startled expression.
Oh, wow. Well, to start out here, the poetic language in this novel is so arresting that I found myself stopping and absorbing and stopping and absorbing. And I really enjoyed it. How was it adapting to the demands of poetry, from the demands of poetry to the demands of a novel?
Sure. I mean, so I don't know if this was mentioned in my bio, but I did kind of come to fiction through poetry. I was a poet first. And I guess I'll start with what I think poetry gave me, and then I'll think about what fiction kind of demands. I mean, I think writing poetry gives you like a real kind of attention to the line. Mm-hmm. I think the organizing unit of poetry is not just the line, but like the word and even the syllable. Mm-hmm. Like poems have to make a sort of like rhythmic or sonic sense. In addition to, saying something, the content making sense. And so I do think writing poetry gave me a sort of ear for that sonic quality to language. And so then moving into writing fiction, and especially a novel, there are all sorts of other things that have to kind of go on in a novel, from a, rising action and pacing perspective and characterization. And I think probably what I found most challenging, I am still somebody who reads for writing primarily, but I completely understand that like pretty writing alone does not sustain interest for most readers. And so I think working with my agents and editors and really being like, okay, what are the clear plot beats in this novel, and specifically with the sort of the court plot line, but also the sort of like mystery of Smith's friend Elle's death. Those were these two kind of parallel plot lines that I wanted to have at times a more kind of atmospheric quality and be an opportunity really for Smith to kind of more be reflecting on his background and the demands of Black respectability politics and all these things, but also for those plot lines to kind of like surface at certain moments and give us maybe more satisfying plot beats.
Okay. Oh, all right, good. So that segues into, if you read for writing, who are you reading? Who inspires you? Or who did you read that just lit you up and gave you permission to be a poet and a novelist?
Sure. I mean, so the first book that ever made me want to write was a book of poetry called Crush by Richard Seikin. I don't know if anyone's read that, but
Extra points if you have.
but a friend gave it to me when I was maybe 15.
Uh-huh.
And I remember reading it overnight, and I was just completely enthralled with the language in that book. I think it's about to enter a 25th year reprint. But it's this book of poetry that's about a sort of like doomed romance, like young love. And it's in the introduction to it, which is the introduction's written by Louise Glick. The first line of the introduction is, "This is a book about panic. The word is never mentioned." And I think, I mean, that really captures, I think, the kind of feel of that book. It's incredibly evocative. It has an urgency. It has a panicked quality. And it just felt completely different from, I think, like the poetry we were reading in English class. Like it was, it felt really fresh, and it was queer. And I think it was the first thing that I read that I was like, I really want to be able to do this. And then in college, I think I minored in poetry, and I think added more writers to the stable of influences, from Claudia Rankine to Inez Smith, Said Jones, and others. And then when I was writing this book, which I guess I started in my mid-20s, so I'd already been writing fiction for a little bit, I was looking a lot at Joan Didion. I was looking a lot at writers like Margot Jefferson, who've written about the sort of like Black bourgeoisie. But Margot Jefferson, I think, is a particular writer because she's a nonfiction writer and a journalist, but still has a real like lyrical quality to her prose. I think James Baldwin also does that balance very well of tackling politics, but doing it in a poetic way. So those were some of the sort of stable of writers.
Pretty good stable. Did you ever write short stories?
I did, actually. So this book kind of began as a short story.
Really?
I wrote a short story called Smith, which of course is the name of the protagonist in Great Black Hope, before I started working on this as a novel. I think I knew basically the seeds of this book were that I first wrote like 10 pages on this character that were just kind of about his background, and he has a lot of overlap with me, and I was interested in writing a character who would like me live this life split between the kind of southern Black bourgeoisie world of his parents and the downtown New York club scene, and would have these tensions between the different worlds he inhabited. So I started with that character, and then I had an idea that I wanted to do it not in first person, because I'd pretty much only ever written fiction in first person. But I think because I was going to be writing about this protagonist who had so much in common with me, I wanted this sort of critical distance of even a very close third person. And so to test out the voice, I wrote a short story with Smith as the protagonist, and it just followed him on a day in New York, basically. And then I've written a few other stories that I really like, but I think in a way I kind of jumped from poetry straight to trying to write novels, because before I published this, I had this other novel idea that I'd been working on for a while. So I think I just wanted to take the big swing and
All
go
right.
straight to novel.
Yeah, well, it's a homer. You parse the clubbing culture as a backdrop for the death of Elle, and it becomes, at least for this bumpkin, kind of a purgatory you know. And can you talk about writing about that? I mean, it's very specific. It's very evocative. I feel like I've sort of been there and done that, and now I don't have to.
Yeah.
So tell me about that.
Yeah, I always really love a good party scene in a novel, and I also enjoy writing them. Both the other now shelved manuscript that I'd been working on, which is set in Berlin, in the kind of techno scene in Berlin, and this novel, I think, could both be described as party novels. And I'm really interested in nightlife spaces, in part because they're these interesting like containers for, you know, they force together people from different worlds. And so all of the tensions that exist in the world on a day-to-day are then kind of compacted into these spaces where also people are, you know, on substances and behaving in these kind of altered ways. And just, I think, artistically, it's like an interesting, or narratively, it's an interesting container for me to look at. And so writing the nightclub scenes in this, I think it was a combination of, often if I'm at a party or something and I see somebody who's dressed in an interesting way, or I overhear a bit of dialogue that speaks to me, I'll write a note of it in my phone. So I'm often, I think, like gathering kind of field notes that make their way into my prose, specifically for those kind of party scenes. So I think a lot of that is based on my own observation.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wanted to make sure, at least in Great Black Hope, I think there's almost two versions of that nightlife scene. There's kind of clubbing in flashback before Elle's death. And in those flashback scenes, I wanted to show the appeal of it for Smith. Yeah. I wanted it to feel alluring and glittering, and have a kind of, maybe even a sort of levity, that in the more like present tense nightlife scene is no longer there. Like it is, with Elle's death, everything has become really like freighted for Smith, and he looks at that world through a new lens. Yeah. And so striking a different tone for those different scenes was important.
Yeah, and you did it very well. It was so evocative. It's wonderful. I was surprised that Smith's sexuality was not an issue with his hyper respectable, hyper high achieving parents. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, or was that just, they're just, you know, hip?
Yeah, people have pointed that out to me, that, you know, Smith is a gay character for whom his queerness or his gayness is not like, it's not the main wedge between him and the kind of other people in his world. And I think it's correct to note that, I mean, I think his sexuality certainly would not be a wedge between him and other people in his sort of like downtown New York world, because there it's like, of course, everyone's gay. But then with his parents, it's also not really kind of the main thing that I think alienates him. We do see at various points, we see like a flashback to when he came out to his mom and her not responding so well. But I think it just, to me, maybe felt more current. I think it's probably truer to my own experience and the experience of friends of mine around my age from a kind of similar background, where, you know, Smith's parents think of themselves as progressive, but still have a kind of discomfort about, you know, him having any sort of sexuality. So I almost think like the way it would play out in his family and the way it kind of plays out in the book is like his parents just don't ask personal questions about his sexuality. So it's not some harrowing thing that they're kind of contending with on a day-to-day, but it is still something that marks him apart from his family unit, and I think is part of the driver for him to want to forge this life of his own in New York, outside of their gaze.
Right. Okay. You've said in interviews that readers take different things from your book. Some people come away saying, "Oh, it's the most hilarious novel I've ever read," and other people say, "This is heavy duty. It's about class. It's about race." I would add to that list that it's a novel of manners, and that you and Jane Austen have actually rather a lot in common. Has anyone else compared you to Jane Austen yet?
I hope behind my back.
Maybe,
I think other people have picked up on it being a novel of manners. I had a conversation actually with Margot Jefferson, who I mentioned earlier, who really focused on that aspect of the book. And I'm an Austen fan. Austen was definitely kind of one of my formative influences. And so I am very interested in that tradition, or Edith Wharton, or Fitzgerald, or anyone who is writing about class and all of the affect that kind of comes with it, and all the restrictions that come with it, and what goes unsaid.
Yes.
I think something that I definitely borrow from some of the writers mentioned above, and certainly Austen, is that there's so much subtext.
Yes.
In these scenes, we'll see the dialogue, and then we'll see Smith parsing everything for subtext and like actual meaning. So there's the thing that's being said, and then there's the thing that the sayer actually means, and then there's the truth. And he's trying to navigate all of those kind of at once, which I think novels of manners are interested in.
Yeah.
And I also think that Smith, because he's a character who he's so used to performing himself, so used to walking into different rooms and kind of assessing what people expect from him, what people want from him, and then kind of playing into that expectation. He is then hyper aware when other people are doing that as well. Like he's very aware of the performances that everyone else around him is upholding, and very kind of sensitive to that.
He's such a great character, and you're not going to abandon him now. Are you going to? Are you? Are you going to write some more about? He's so observant. He's so sharp. He's also so funny.
Thank you. Yeah, I could see myself picking back up his story kind of down the line. For now, I think I'm going to step away from. I think this book. Something that it gave me is that it was just an opportunity for me to excavate and I think kind of probe a lot of questions and frustrations I'd had since I was, a teenager.
Yeah.
And now that I've written it, I think I'm much more interested in looking at worlds that I have almost nothing to do with. And so I've been the new novel that I've been working on is set in the tech world. And I'm really liking that it's forcing me to do research and, talk to people I've lost touch with from college and really kind of dive into a world that is not my own, rather than lay bare these worlds that I have moved through. But I could see myself picking back up Smith.
Okay, good. I look forward to it. You've talked about what the book gives you, which is such a wonderful topic to hear a novelist describe, what did you get from writing this book? What would you like readers to take away? I know that's a loaded, super
I
loaded
mean,
question.
I think many things. I guess when I was writing this, I was thinking of it in some ways as a political novel, where I do want readers to come away with a desire to bring more like criticality and empathy to conversations around addiction, and what the kind of easy narrative around addiction can be, and I'd like this book to help readers question those kind of easy narratives, and around, I guess, identity as well. But I also think that there is just the book does end on a kind of more hopeful note, in a bunch of different ways, but one of them being in the central friendship in the book, other than Smith and Elle, is with Smith and Carolyn, who we see that they're from very different kind of identity backgrounds, and often through the book that's a source of frustration. They're often kind of speaking past one another, or Smith is feeling like she can't really understand his experience. At some point we kind of see that she in some ways feels the same way about him. But I think that they ultimately, that relationship is like undergirded by a lot of love, and ultimately they kind of make the determination that love is enough to kind of keep striving across this, or reaching across this distance between them, which I do think is a very maybe contemporary problem. That's, I think, something a lot of us face, and I hope readers feel a more kind of hopeful tinge to the end of the book.
Yes. Well, this one did, and but you bring up addiction, and I just want to give a plug for the way that's handled in the novel. That you see kind of a spectrum of, people who might be developing a real dependency, all the way up to someone who says, "Look, I can't do this anymore." And I'm really interested in those early stages that we don't talk about very much. It's, oh yeah, he drinks a lot or whatever.
Sure.
So I really, I love that
Thank you.
aspect of it. I have one more question, and then we'll open it up to the questions on the floor. And that is, can you talk about Art for Black Lives for a minute?
Sure. Yes, so Art for Black Lives is an organization that I started with a friend, my friend Camila. I guess we started it in summer of 2020. And so we'd basically seen a bunch of print sales popping up that were mostly to generate revenue for bail funds at the time. Like, of course, a big summer of protests. A lot of people were getting arrested at those protests. And so a lot of curators and artists were organizing these print sales. And Camila and I wanted to create something that would be more ongoing, that would use that model, but not just to kind of like generate a bunch of cash quickly to bail people out of jail for protesting, but to provide a more kind of ongoing material support to marginalized communities. So we did, I think we've done maybe 6 rounds of it over the years, and gotten to work with a lot of great visual artists and photographers, some of whom I'm a huge fan of, and have raised a lot of money for basically organizations that provide housing, food support, et cetera, to the Black trans community. And I think, some of that kind of grassroots organizing stuff made its way into the book as well. Like, I think that my work with that organization kind of informed some of the Mona Tia-O material, which I know will not make sense to most people.
Until you buy and read the book. Right.
But yeah, that was, I felt very lucky to be able to do that as a sort of side project while I was in grad school.
Great, thank you. Okay, anybody have anything to ask or say or congratulate? Yes.
You talked a little bit about the challenges of poetry versus fiction. And so I was wondering what your motivation was to move from poetry to fiction.
I don't know if it was as intentional as like I'm making a pivot to focusing on fiction. I mean, I started trying to write a novel right after college. I worked like a super corporate job that I did not like very much, and I think I felt very far from my creative self, and almost just as a project to get me back to writing. I started working on a different novel from this one, and I think once, because a novel is such a big project and sort of demands, at least for me, it demands that I work on it almost every day, versus poetry. Even when I was writing a lot of poetry, a poem, can be written in an afternoon. So I could kind of wait for inspiration to strike in a way that with a novel, you kind of have to just keep working at it. So I think having a novel project was a way to force myself back into a sort of writing routine. And then once I was in that, fiction just seemed like the kind of the right medium for that sort of practice. And that, I also think I've had more ideas for fiction projects lately. Most of my poetry tends to be, I'll write poems often about like a moment or a memory, and poems don't really occur to me anymore. Like I think once I started focusing on fiction more, my mind just kind of thinks in potential like short story or novel concepts rather than in poems. Unfortunately, I'd like to get back to writing both.
Good. Yeah.
It's a total pleasure to listen to you talk about your work. It makes me think you must be a really good teacher. Can you talk about teaching writing?
Sure. So I teach an intro writing course at an art school in Manhattan. And so in the fall, I teach it as a 20th century New York literature class. And so we do everything from Harlem Renaissance to the Beat Poets to like 80s in New York to contemporary like autofiction, and also get my students to do some creative writing of their own. And I really like teaching. Especially teaching art students, I think their minds work in a very different way than mine. They tend to be very like associative. So, I'll ask them to interpret like an image, and the way they understand it is so different. Like the things they pick up on are so different from what I would pick up on. Which, yeah, I think it expands my kind of creative practice and helps me see things in a different way. So I find it a very generative job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your writing routine and what you do when you're stuck?
Yes. So right now, I'm trying to get back into a good routine with writing. At best, I mean, when I was writing Great Black Hope, I was in grad school. This was my MFA thesis. And I started writing it fall of 2020, so height of the pandemic. I had very few distractions. And, it was easy enough for me to work on it every single day. So I wrote a draft of this book in a year, and then I edited it for like 3.5 years. So at best, my routine is get up, go for a run, then go sit at a coffee shop and write for maybe 3 hours. And then in the afternoon, do more like money work. So create papers, or I had various freelance things that I was doing. And for the project that I'm working on now, if I could get back to writing 5 days a week, I feel good about that. But I'm working my way up. Oh, and what do I do when I'm stuck? I mean, I think I have certain writers who I reread, who either rhythmically like kind of do something for me. There's just like a kind of music to their sentences that's satisfying to me. Or I mean, writers who I love a lot. Just reading really good writing, I think, reminds me of the point of this, and that even if I have, 5 frustrating writing days in a row, that eventually it can get good, and that's like a very worthy pursuit. So I have certain things that I tend to reread if I'm feeling stuck.
And what are those? We can't wait.
I mean, for instance, like especially with this book, I would reread Goodbye to All That, the Joe Didion essay, a lot when I was working on this, because it also, I think, had its like take on New York City was kind of similar to what I was trying to achieve. Other things. My thesis advisor is a novelist named Katie Kitamura, who I think she just writes gorgeously kind of economical, spare prose that I think is often very perfect in its rhythms. And I would listen to her books on audiobook, which I've already read all of them, but sometimes I would listen to them before I sat down to write again, to just kind of like get rhythms in my head. So books like A Separation or Intimacies. I'm sure there were many more, but yeah.
Okay, good. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, thanks. So I am also someone who started with poetry and moved into prose, and I was really tickled when I read Maggie Nelson, I forget which book, it might have been Bluets, where she says, I wanted to be a poet because I didn't want to have to write plot.
Yeah.
And that stayed with me because I have a real resistance to plot, even though I work in prose. And I was curious, you talked about how it was your agents and your editors who helped you emerge from the work a plot, helped you, create those plot beats, as you said. But there are other ways of thinking about plot. And I was wondering about whether you struggle with plot, there is this kind of mainstream pressure to have plot, right? And how you negotiate that and how you think about plot, because there's a lot of ways to approach it.
That's a great question. And I'll also say Bluets by Maggie Nelson is another favorite in a book that I return to often. I think when I wrote this book, I wasn't totally sure what I wanted it to be. Like I was initially envisioning it as a more digressive, kind of like bin learnery novel that probably was not plot driven. And I won't lie, I do think my agents pushed it in that direction, but I actually do think for this particular story, there were certain things that I was doing where there's this whole kind of mystery plot line that I was like still in the book in the previous version, but it was all kind of like condensed into this one flashback. And my agents were kind of like, okay, well, how about instead of that, you take those out and turn them into like individual scenes that are kind of helping to be like a spine for the novel. And it was an idea that I'm sure I initially felt resistant to, but once I tried it, did result in some of my favorite scenes in the novel. And so I'm not somebody who needs a book to be plot driven to love it. A lot of my favorite novels aren't very plot driven. They're voice driven or ideas driven. But for this particular book, which I still think is like a novel of ideas in many ways, it was more like not kind of shying away from plot was sort of, I think, like the middle ground that we came to was, I was already telling the story, but I was telling it in a less kind of like compulsively readable way. And it wasn't clear that that was like serving the novel. But yeah, I think it's always a kind of, you know, the art and commerce push-pull. You know, there were also ideas that came from my agents that I just said no to, that felt too commercial, or just didn't feel like my voice. So.
Question.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about this, holding this tension between plot and ideas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about your character, Smith, is there some central idea or question that he's trying to address or resolve?
I think, I don't know if he is aware that this is...
some question for him.
Yeah, I think one of the central questions of the novel is what is the cost of like Black respectability politics? So
What
the
is
sort
the
of
cost of Black respectability?
Black respectability politics. So yeah, a kind of, you know, Smith is a character who's been very much schooled by his parents and his background to present in a certain way and speak in a certain way and, you know, strive towards kind of excellence at all times. And I was interested in how that for him as a character becomes a kind of like cancer inside of him and is sort of like taking a really taxing mental toll on him. And we see also other characters in his orbit who either kind of perfectly uphold a sort of image of Black excellence or fail to, and what costs are kind of then associated with that failure or with the ability to perfectly uphold a kind of performance. And so I think that is one of the central questions of, like, one of my central questions for the Smith character, and something that he's beginning to wonder himself by like the middle of the book.
And are you carrying that question sort of as a through line for yourself? I can imagine returning to that question would be almost like a way to keep like a guidance system for the novel, you know, like what that central question is, like, what's the cost of this for Smith?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, when I wrote the first draft, you know, I wrote it quickly. I was thinking of it as this digressive novel of ideas. It had probably too many ideas. And I probably, after writing the first draft of this, could not have told you, you know, I could tell you the plot, but I couldn't tell you what it was about. And then a friend of mine from my MFA cohort read it, and he described it as a takedown of Black respectability politics, which I don't know that I would describe it necessarily as a takedown so much as an examination. But once he said that, I was like, oh, that's a really interesting description of this novel. That hadn't even occurred to me, that that's like one of the central thematic through lines. And so then when I was going back in and editing, it was really helpful to have a couple of guiding questions, kind of as you said, so that I could determine what didn't feel like it needed to be in this novel, versus what was still in the kind of like constellation of ideas at the center of this project.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One more question. If they're not any, oh, yes.
Hi, this sounds incredible. Thanks so much for being here. You spoke briefly about a current project you're working on that now focuses more on the tech world. Without giving too much away, are you finding that you're writing about some central themes that show up in your debut novel? Are you seeing kind of a through line in what you write about?
I'm sure there are. I mean, I think I'm always interested in like class tensions. Like that's definitely present in this book and will be present in the tech novel, but I think in pretty different ways. But I do think I have pretty new concerns with this very much in progress. So we'll see what it actually becomes. New novel. Yeah, I think I have a lot of one overlap is just the question of like how do young people make meaning, and I think that the young people in this book are trying to make meaning through art making or indulgence, or sedating themselves from their realities. And I think the people in my tech novel, I mean, at least some of them are like interested in the question of like eradicating death, and like externalizing consciousness. And I think they have really different approaches to the very like fundamental human question of like, how do we contend with mortality? And but yeah, I'm sure there are some thematic overlap.
Thank you so much for being here. This is wonderful.